No one claims CCS to be a silver bullet, but it's one of the measures that we need to deploy in order to get to a net zero energy system. I think we have to recognize that moving from our current energy system to a new energy system will take time. I think the public debate is now aligning that CCS has a role to play.
Hi, I'm Bryony Mackenzie.
And I'm Eddie Veal.
And welcome to the Energy Podcast from Shell, the home of conversation about the energy that powers our world. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about CCS, carbon capture and storage.
That's it.
So for the uninitiated, Eddie, give us a little summary of what CCS is.
Okay. So at a high level, it's about making sure that CO2 doesn't make it into the atmosphere. And so the way that I like to think about it is you capture the CO2 and then you transport it and then you store it underground.
The reason that we're talking about CCS today is it's so important to the energy transition.
Absolutely.
And we've spoken about it before, actually, on other episodes of the Energy Podcast. And it's come a long way. So what we're going to be covering today with an expert guest is where we've been, but also where we are now, right?
Yeah, and also where we're going, because I think that's important too.
Eddie, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, but just a quick note before we start to ensure that we're all on the same page. When we say Shell or we're talking about Shell PLC and its subsidiaries in general. The companies in which Shell PLC directly and indirectly owns investments are separate legal entities. Okay, that's done. Should we get to it?
Let's do it.
I'm really pleased to welcome our guest, Bernhard Koudelka, who's VP for CCS at Shell. Good to have you here, Bernhard. Kick us off with how you came to be in charge of CCS at Shell.
Yeah, thanks, Bryony, and thanks for having me. Real pleasure to be here. Been with the company 25 years. I started as an engineer. I was a drilling engineer for the first part of my Shell career, working at the coal phase of our business, getting some early operational responsibilities, but realized at one point that my strengths probably lie elsewhere. So I then moved into the commercial field, went back to school, did an MBA, worked a number of years in M&A before I then moved into more commercial leadership roles across the business. And since about 2 years, I'm now the head of carbon capture and storage.
The UN IPCC and the IEA both recognize the importance of CCS as it relates to the global energy transition. What are your views on that topic?
All of those institutions, when they describe the net zero emissions energy scenarios, see a vital role for carbon capture and storage. I think there's probably two fundamental reasons why that is. So the first one is we have industries that have CO2 emissions that are independent of the use of fossil fuels, and they will need to have a solution. And CCS at the moment is seen as one of the most competitive ways to decarbonize those industries. And also, even in a net zero energy world, you still have residual use of hydrocarbons, and you may have to have some carbon dioxide removals. And CCS provides a tool in combination, for example, with direct air capture or with biomass to actually have negative emissions. So I think the public debate is now aligning that CCS has a role to play.
Just going back to the energy transition question, you mentioned the hard to abate sectors. So those sectors that are perhaps, cement, steel, those kind of industries that CCS is going to be really useful for. I think there's also an argument that's often made, and you would have heard it as well, that CCS is just a lifeline for fossil fuel companies to keep producing. And with that in mind, do you think that CCS delays the overall energy transition from where you're sitting?
No one claims CCS to be a silver bullet, but it's just one of the measures that we need to deploy in order to get to a net zero energy system. I think in the narrative basically says CCS is only there to basically capture CO2 from burning fossil fuels, and therefore, if you would stop using CCS, you would also force industry to shift away from the use of fossil fuels. I think there are two big assumptions in that argument that I personally think are flawed. First one is that CCS is only needed for the burning of fossil fuel, which is not true, because you have industries like you referenced, cement, for example, or lime, that actually have process emissions that don't stem from the burning of hydrocarbons, but they are process emissions. And the second assumption is that industry has a choice. I think we have to recognize that moving from our current energy system to a new energy system will take time. We have a lot of installed industrial capacity. And to make a switch from our current fuel environment to the new one will take time. And therefore, I think CCS can be a solution that's here and now to actually avoid CO2 emissions being emitted into the atmosphere. So in that regard, I do think CCS has a vital role to play in the short term, but also in the longer term for some of this industry that would find it otherwise hard to decarbonize.
Can you maybe expand a little bit more on those sectors that you think CCS is most relevant?
As we said, CCS is not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea for the energy transition. A net zero energy system will mean that we will fundamentally change the way we live, the way we work, the way we move, the way we play. And we essentially need all the tools that are available to us. So first of all, I think we as a society need to become a lot more energy efficient. We need to electrify as much as we can. We need to switch fuels from traditional fossil fuels today to hydrogen, ammonia, biofuels. But also we need to have a tool like CCS. So let me unpack sort of the three key areas for CCS that I see going forward. The first one is indeed the industry that you mentioned that are hard to abate. So we talked about cement, we talked about limestone, but there are others. There are waste incinerators. There are agricultural processes like ethanol production, for example, or metallurgic processes that have actually CO2 stemming from a process rather than the burning of fossil fuels. And therefore, CCS is often the only or the most competitive way to decarbonize those industries. So CCS will have a role to play if we want to get to a true net zero industrial system in the future. The other one is we have to recognize that we have a very large installed industrial base. So building CCS hubs in location where we have a lot of industrial activity today can help to decarbonize those industry as we go through the energy transition. That will save jobs, that will bring economic prosperity to those industrial heartlands that may otherwise perhaps be disadvantaged in a shift of the industrial base to the newer energy systems. And the third component for CCS for me is carbon dioxide removal. So even in a net zero energy system, you still have some use of hydrocarbons, for example, in aviation. And therefore, you will need to also remove CO2 from the system. And there are a couple of technologies that are currently out there, particularly engineered ones. Those are direct air capture or bioenergy plus CCS, so essentially burning biomass and then capturing the CO2 and storing underground. And for both of these technologies, CCS is of course a fundamental building block, and we think the role of CCS in those applications will actually significantly increase even beyond the short to medium term in the longer term.
Can you maybe paint us a picture of where Shell's CCS business and portfolio is right now?
CCS is not a single technology, but a basket of technologies. And when we look at the different elements of CCS technology, you have to capture, the transport and storage. Shell is active along the full CCS value chain. So of course, Shell is an emitter. We are a technology provider. So we have developed in-house technology, both what is called pre-combustion and post-combustion technology. So capturing carbon before and after the combustion processes. And we are of course active in the transportation of CO2 and the storage of CO2. So in the transportation, Shell is one of the early developers of CO2 ships, and we have a number of storage positions around the globe. We have 3 assets that are in operation. So we have a project in Canada called Quest, where we actually the operator. We have another project in Australia, Gorgon, where we are in a partnership with Chevron, with Exxon. And we're just about to start up a project in Norway called Northern Lights in a partnership with Equinor and Total Energy. Besides those 3, we also have 3 projects that are currently in execution. So an expansion of the Northern Lights joint venture. We also have another project in Canada called Atlas Polaris, where we want to store 650,000 tons from the Scotford refinery. And we have a project in the Netherlands where we want to decarbonize the Pernis refinery.
So give us a sense of how much CCS is operating globally today and what share of global emissions have been captured.
So today, the world stores around 50 million tons of carbon per year, which is about 0.1% of global CO2 emissions.
It's actually a really small amount of global emissions.
So not one, it's not insignificant, but it's nowhere near what we need for a net zero energy system. So you referenced the IPCC or the IEA scenarios earlier, and under those we probably require anywhere between 3 to 7 gigaton of CCS by 2050, which means roughly the world would have to scale what we do today 100-fold in order to meet the requirements of a net zero emissions energy system.
By 2050.
By 2050. In a way, we have a pipeline of projects of around 300 million ton of injection capacity. So that's the sort of the project pipeline that we see in the world today. And some reports would indicate that we perhaps reach a gigaton of injection capacity by the mid-2030s. But we do have to recognize that the pace at which the industry develops right now is not on a trajectory to reach sort of the 1.5 degree target under the Paris Accord. It would require a much more significant scaling in the years to come.
I mean, there's so many lessons, right, that have been learned. Like you said, the CCS has been around for years.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about that learning process, right, it takes a lot. It takes money, it takes time, it takes cooperation across industries, across companies. It's hard to do. So maybe talk us through what we've learned over the past couple of years.
Yeah, no, it's very hard to do. Indeed, there's no single company or entity that can build a CO2 capture and sequestration value chain. So first of all, you need different parts of that value chain to come together. So you need an emitter, and you need somebody who provides transport services, you need somebody who provides storage services, essentially all sanctioned projects at the same time to develop a CCS value chain. At the same time, you need regulations that are in place, so you have clarity of what it means to get a CO2 sequestration license, what are the monitoring requirements for storing CO2 underground, what are the liability regimes around storing CO2 underground, and of course you need regulations that incentivize emitters to decarbonize. And you need to have the public and the public acceptance to actually use CCS as a tool to decarbonize. All of these areas of the value chain need to work together seamlessly to get these early projects off the ground. And then if you want to scale the industry, you also need to have financial institutions and insurance institutions to come to the table to effectively scale this, because the capital required to go from 50 million tons that we have today to a multi-gigaton CO2 injection system by 2050 will be significant. And therefore, it requires a system that allows capital to basically effectively flow into the industry and make returns that are commensurate with the risks that they're taking.
Is there anything that you're worried about holding that progress back?
If we talk about the conditions that we need, so first of all, we need carbon pricing. You need to have incentive mechanisms for industry to decarbonize, and that carbon pricing needs to be stable and it needs to be transparent and clear. At the same time, you need to have regulations that make it possible for us to invest in CO2 value chains. Like, as I mentioned, you need to have clarity on what is your access to geological storage, what are your monitoring requirements, what are your liabilities when you inject, what are the CO2 specifications so you can interact with other elements of the value chain. All of that clarity needs to be there in the regulatory environment. You also ultimately need to probably see the emergence of more voluntary carbon markets to really underpin investments into decarbonization. So, for example, when you talk about CCS, ultimately as an emitter, if you store your carbon and you lower the carbon intensity of your product, if you're able to price differentiate based on the carbon intensity of your product, so for example, you can charge more for products with a lower carbon intensity, it will open up a voluntary demand for decarbonization, which hopefully then helps to close the value gap between what CCS costs today and what customers can afford to pay.
So does that then imply, though, that it is cheaper to maybe just emit carbon right now than to store it?
I think it's true to say that the customer's willingness to pay and the price point of CCS are still creating a value gap. And that value gap can often only be closed through the support of governments. Over time, though, we believe that that value gap will close and customers and transport and storage operators will be able to interact more freely. There's a couple of things that I think will happen that enable that. So one is, at the moment, the industry is very nascent, very new. So we are lacking some of the fundamental infrastructure, like aggregation infrastructure, for example, like pipelines, terminals. Once that is built, of course, the costs of providing CCS services will come down. I talked about the emergence, hopefully, of a voluntary demand to decarbonize products, which should stimulate the demand for decarbonization services. And ultimately, with technological developments and carbon pricing will come to a point where the business model will emerge where we require less and less direct government support into the industry.
I mean, the value gap, obviously people would say that CCS is potentially over-reliant on government money, and that creates a problem. Do you think that's the case? Or like you said, that value gap is going to shrink, in an adequate amount of time?
I think it's fair to say that the early projects that we currently see are all very much dependent on direct government support, right? So we look at the UK, for example, you have the track system where the UK government pledged over £20 billion into the industry. You see projects like Northern Lights that have been substantially funded by the Norwegian government. You look at Quest, the early project that I mentioned in Canada, which was also supported by the Alberta government and the federal government in Canada. So a lot of examples where government support and subsidies were absolutely paramount to get the industry off the ground. I do think that will reduce over time, Bryony. I think in a way, if it doesn't, the industry will never scale. The industry can only scale if it can stand on its own 2 feet, if the rewards in the business are commensurate with the risks that we're taking. Only then private capital can flow in. And I think the levers, as I described, are reducing the costs of what CCS costs today, having effective carbon pricing, and ensuring that we ultimately be able to price in the carbon intensity in the products that we all buy today in the market.
And let's come back to Shell's CCS strategy, because I think we've touched on it and we've obviously been involved in many parts of this kind of basket of technologies at various points. But what does it mean for Shell's outlook or our strategy in CCS today?
Shell's vision is to be the leading integrated energy company, and our strategy is to deliver more value with less emissions. And of course, CCS' role in that is to deliver less emissions. And for Shell, not only is CCS an industry that's adjacent to what we do in our traditional businesses like oil and gas, but also it is critically important for what we're trying to achieve now and in the future. So there's probably 3 main strategic areas where CCS plays a role for Shell. The first one is it's a solution for our own emissions, for our own assets. So when you look at the early projects that we have sanctioned and are currently building or operating, a lot of them are actually linked to our own operations. So Quest, for example, is linked to the Scotford Upgrader. An upgrader is basically a piece of a refinery in Canada. Gorgon Australia is linked to our Gorgon LNG facility. You see that, for example, Portos in the Netherlands is linked to the Pernis refinery. Atlas Polaris is again linked to the Scotford refinery. So a lot of what we do in the early phases is linked to our own emissions to reduce our own scope 1 and 2. The second area for Shell where this is interesting is that we can offer lower carbon products to our customers. So think about abated LNG, for example, where we reduce the carbon intensity of our LNG sales, or we reduce the carbon intensity of our products, like low carbon fuels, for example, or we enable blue hydrogen or blue ammonia. And the third reason, and we discussed this a number of times during our conversation, is that even in a net zero energy system, you will have residual CO2 emissions. And in order to capture those, we need to have the ability to provide carbon dioxide removals. And engineered carbon dioxide removals have very likely a role to play. And in that, you have technologies like direct air capture or bioenergy plus CCS. And CCS is a key enabler for both of these technologies to then basically take CO2 from the atmosphere and safely store it on the ground permanently. There are a couple of areas where companies like Shell are advantaged in the CCS space, particularly in the transport and storage element of it. The first one is we're dealing with the geosphere, right? So you're dealing with the subsurface, and the subsurface inherently carries uncertainties, and the ability to characterize the subsurface is something that is very close to our own DNA. We're also talking about building pipelines, platforms, drilling wells, something that Shell has done for over 100 years. But also the nature of the industry. The industry has a very long capital cycle. So when you look at a CCS project, it takes about 10 years to build it. You then operate it for 20 to 30 years, and then you probably, post-closing it, you still have to monitor the subsurface. So the capital cycle is like 50, 60, 70 years long, and the ability to manage risks over such a long capital cycle is very similar, again, to what we do in the oil and gas industry.
I think it's world first, or at least one of the first, CCS as a service. You mentioned Northern Lights before, but give us a significance of what's happening in the Northern Lights project and tell us what it is in a nutshell.
Northern Lights is a fantastic project. It's a joint venture between ourselves, Total and Equinor, and it's part of a broader government initiative in Norway to decarbonize industry. It's called the Longship Project, and Northern Lights is essentially the transport and storage element of that value chain. And it's the world's first cryogenic value chain. So cryogenic value chain means that an emitter captures the CO2, they then liquefy it, they put it on a ship. The ship then sails to Norway, where the CO2 gets offloaded and then basically transported via pipeline offshore and stored more than 2.5 kilometers underneath the Norwegian continental shelf. And that project has been finished in the first phase, so it is mechanically complete last year, and we're expecting the first delivery shortly.
And totally different to any other projects. It does sound sort of logistically very challenging, but like you said, very exciting as well for CCS.
So traditionally, a lot of the projects that are in operations are where you have an emitter that is connected via pipeline to a storage location. So you essentially take the CO2 and you pump it through a pipeline and then you inject it on the ground. So the novelty factor here is indeed the shipping component, the cryogenic component of those value chains. And it is really important to connect emitters with storage locations where there is no immediate storage location in the proximity. And I think, therefore, it is a really good proof point for what these value chains could look like in the future, where you have CO2 sources that are a little bit further away from where we can actually store CO2. So I hope it will be a real enabler for that industry to scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. When you take projects like Northern Lights into consideration, are we at the precipice, or are we close to being commercially viable just for these CCS projects without support from governments or public funds?
Let's use Northern Lights as an example, because I think it's a good case study of how the industry is developing right now. So Northern Lights has two phases. So phase one is 1.5 million tons of CO2 being injected annually. And as I said, that was part of a broader government initiative called the Longship Project. And in that, the Norwegian government basically funded about 80% of that project. The Northern Lights joint venture is just a transport and storage element of the Longship project, but the government also incentivized certain customers to basically build CO2 capture facilities and then transport that CO2 into Northern Lights. In this case, the biggest one is Heidelberg Cement, which is a cement producer in Brevik in Norway. But beyond the initial customers, we've also now signed two commercial customers for the initial phase of Northern Lights. One is Ørsted in Denmark, and the other one is Yara in the Netherlands. Ørsted is basically a bioenergy plus CCS company, and Yara is a fertilizer production.
I think we're going to be speaking to Yara actually in a bit more detail about how they got involved with Northern Lights. Should be really interesting.
And so that was the initial phase of Northern Lights, the first phase. And we've just very recently sanctioned an expansion to that from 1.5 million tons of injection capacity to over 5 million tons. And paramount for that investment decision was, again, to have a customer linked up to that expansion project, which is Stockholm Exergi in Stockholm, a bioenergy company that basically uses biomass to produce power and heat for the community of Stockholm. And they will take that CO2 and store it in the second phase of Northern Lights. And those are, for me, the first proof points of actually having commercial contracts between customers and transport and storage providers. And I hope they will set a precedent for the industry and help us to learn and grow based on those experiences.
Can you maybe just summarize and wrap up the business case to why would we spend the money on CCS?
Capital stewardship and capital discipline is absolutely critical as we invest into any of the low carbon businesses. And you will have seen that we have been quite selective about our investments in the CCS space historically, and expect the same going forward. In the past, we really invested in projects where we had the ability to basically integrate the value chains effectively, where we had customers who were willing and able to pay for CO2 transport and storage services. And I expect that to be the same going forward. As an industry, we need to make sure, and we talked about this earlier, that the industry ultimately can stand on its own 2 feet, right? That the industry delivers returns that are commensurate with the risk that the industry is taking. And this is still an industry that has subsurface uncertainty, has a number of technical and non-technical risks. So getting customers that are able to afford CCS and to basically provide business models that carry the risks effectively between the different parts of the value chain will be absolutely critical. So we're looking for those areas where you see stable and supporting regulations, where we see the emergence of business models that actually work. But I hope that over time we will see that in more parts of the world and therefore enable us to scale the business. The other bit that our early positions will enable us to do is to learn effectively. We've invested in Canada, in Europe, in Australia. So we've invested in many different jurisdictions, in different technical archetypes. So we have onshore, like in Canada, or offshore, like in Northern Lights. And as a company, we'll learn where we are advantaged, where we can really bring our best capabilities to those value chains. And based on those learnings, we will then understand how and where to scale this business effectively going forward.
Just want to come to CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage. And that's because we've had a comment on LinkedIn from Jan Erik Salomonsen. Thank you for dropping us your comment. And we do really want everyone to put their questions to us so we can ask them of our experts. So let me ask you this. Why hasn't CO2 been treated like a resource and converted into something we need?
There's, of course, the ambition to ultimately use CO2 as a resource, but the timing and the economic viability of using CO2 as a resource is very uncertain in this stage. And that's why you see companies like Shell spending limited amount of time on this. So maybe what is CO2 utilization? Maybe we'll start there. So CO2 utilization is essentially converting CO2 into new products, like, for example, synthetic fuels. But of course, these processes are very immature and at the moment, as I said, not really economically viable. There's also a very divergent view out in the different institutions what the role of utilization of CO2 is in the future, from virtually nothing to maybe a gigaton or so by 2030. I personally think time will tell whether utilization is important, but the fact is it will never replace the need for permanent sequestration of CO2. It's almost like a combination of CCS for permanent sequestration and CO2 utilization. Both of them will maybe hand in hand help to drive forward a net zero energy system.
That's a good way to sum up the amount of information that we've covered over the podcast. But if you think about it, 4 years ago, we had a similar conversation around CCS.
We had that conversation 4 years ago.
It was you.
It was me.
Yeah.
And I do remember that conversation, but it was slightly different. I felt like we were talking more about the technology and does it work and is it proven? It would be vastly different listen, although you can listen to it again if you want to.
But you can't watch.
But you can't watch.
I guess on that same trajectory that we've been over the past 4 years, if we were to do this again in 4 years, what do you think we would be talking about, and where do you hope that we are as an industry?
I do think we've come a long way over the last 4 years. And yes, perhaps the pace of scaling of the industry is not what some people will have hoped, but we have achieved a number of proof points, right? We talked about Quest, we talked about Northern Lights, all of these projects where we're still sort of gaining experiences 4 years ago, and then Northern Lights is now just about to start up. So I think technically we are a lot more mature and have a lot better understanding that we had 4 years ago. And now you see the project pipeline that is out there is significantly larger than it was 4 years ago. Now, in 4 years, what do I expect? First of all, I expect the first cryogenic value chains to actually be up and running, and we will have experience that we will have shared with the broad audience. We will hopefully have seen a lot more investments in different parts of the world. And I also hope that we'll be talking about the emergence of new business models that really enable us to scale the industry much faster than we have been able to do over the last few years.
What I really enjoyed about this conversation as well is that you've been at Shell for 25 years.
25 years.
When you started, obviously you started in upstream. Had you even heard of CCS? Or did you ever talk about CCS when you first started? Now you're the VP for CCS.
It's interesting. So the first time I touched CCS was actually in my studies. When I did my MBA, we had a project where we basically had to do almost like a little mini thesis, and I did mine on CCS and the role.
Okay.
But not in your engineering studies.
No, it was part of my MBA, and the question was, what kind of economic incentives would we prefer? Would we prefer basically a carbon pricing system like a cap and trade system as opposed to tax regime? So that was sort of the detail of my thesis at that time, which was my first touch point with CCS.
Do you ever look back on it from what you wrote there to where we are now and kind of see where you're right?
Should we put that in the show notes?
Absolutely.
We will not put in the show notes, I don't think. Otherwise, they'll take my degree away.
I don't know. If you're looking for a light read tonight, that might not be a bad one.
Exactly. I think you've got one of the most interesting jobs in Shell, certainly.
I think so too.
At the moment. Thank you so much for your time today. It's really lovely to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Bernhard, for a wonderful conversation.
I think a lot of what he said was just really thought-provoking. I don't know what your kind of key takeaways were from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was around the basket of technology that he referred to when he talked about CCS. And it's not just one solution, but it's a bunch of them that address this not just scientific problem, but a system one that we're going after.
And it was the speed of which CCS is developing now as well, that we're in a period of acceleration. I thought that was really interesting. And also he mentioned Northern Lights. And if you're wanting to know more about CCS, I've been speaking to Lisa Winter. She's from Yarra. And they're a customer of Northern Lights as well. So that will be a bonus episode that you can catch up on as well, which should be good.
Fascinating. And before you go, drop us a rating, share the video with a friend, and subscribe to the Energy Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
You can also watch us on YouTube, and if you can follow us on Shell social media as well. And if you've got any themes, comments, questions for our guests, of course, you can get in touch.
Yeah, as you saw today, we actually read them, and we'll be happy to get more.
And remember, you can find Shell's cautionary note and references from today's episodes down below in the show notes.
It was a good one.
It was. Look forward to seeing you again on the Energy Podcast very soon.